Today is August 8th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, I posted a talk titled Why One Should Vote Against the Republicans. And throughout the video, I explained again and again and again the importance and value of practicing arguing on both sides of controversial issues. I explained again and again and again that it was important to attempt to argue on both sides of issues and to try to find the best arguments that might support an opposing view. Despite the fact that I explained that again and again and again, despite the fact that I explained that Christians make many mistakes in politics by not being more careful with reasoning, making sure that they actually understand their opponent's arguments and statements before they respond to them, and so on. Though I said that again and again and again, within a few minutes of posting the talk, there were already comments coming in from men and women who did not even listen to the talk, blasting me as a liberal, calling me ignorant, on and on and on. And so I turned off the comments, and I just want to say that's what Democrats have to deal with when they interact with Christians in American society. Those people who responded, I would have no problem if they raised objections to anything that I said. Besides, these arguments are not necessarily my personal beliefs. I have no obligation to share my personal beliefs about anything with anyone. I have my own private life. I make my own private decisions, make my own private financial decisions, talk to my family privately, make my own private business decisions, on and on. The ability to deliberate, the ability to think about both sides of an issue, the ability to talk about things, to take up different arguments, to play devil's advocate, that's all part of an intelligent life. But for many Christians, they just cannot comprehend, they cannot tolerate that freedom of thinking and speaking. And so I turned the comments off, not because I'm upset by opposing comments. Others actually did what I said. I said in the video, if you'd like to respond or follow up on anything that I've said, send me an email. And some people did, because they actually listened to what I said in the talk. But those who were commenting on the YouTube channel, and this is almost always the case, they weren't even listening to the talk. I can look at the analytics on the YouTube channel, and I can see for every video, it tells me how much time the video has been watched for. So if I make a 60-minute video, 60-minute talk, I should say, I can go and look and see that the average listener only listens for 10 minutes or so. So when I see comments coming in, and the average listening time is just a few minutes, which I really don't care about, I can tell that the people commenting are not even listening to the talk. And again, if they would have listened, they would know that I asked for people to respond by email, so that I could actually hold on to it, because I'm too busy to respond on demand to comments and things like that. But if you contact me by email, I can tag it, keep it in my inbox, and when I get some free time, I can respond, and I'm happy to do that. But they were commenting, calling names, making accusations, just totally false, ridiculous accusations. And you can see these people who identify as Christians, who identify as conservatives, who identify as Republicans, they don't care if what they say is true. They don't listen to what anyone says. They don't understand the views of other people. They just fire away reckless comments with no regard for truth or accuracy. And until Christians begin to take responsibility for that, the Christian cause in a democratic society is just going to be laughed out of the room as it is. It's just ridiculous. We're supposed to be, of all people, committed to truth-seeking. We're supposed to be the ones who are careful. We're supposed to be the ones who are thoughtful. We look at the Virgin Mary in the Gospels and we read that she pondered these complicated things in her heart. She deliberated on them. We don't know what her final judgments were because she spent time in deliberation. But these Christian people wrapped up in this right-wing political circle, not that right-wing politics or conservative politics are wrong in their principles, but the behavior of these people is a real hindrance to any possible movement to promote conservative politics. And I hope you all realize that. As long as these people are supported and encouraged and high-fived when they act ignorantly, arrogantly, carelessly, and so on, as long as that's supported and allowed, Christians are going to lose in democratic politics. I've tried to explain that. I have explained that, and it's just nuts. So anyway, with that behind us, and again, that wasn't my personal position, that wasn't my personal political view, or anything like that, so any personal responses were just ignorant and foolish. Tonight what I'd like to do is flip things around and speak on the opposite issue, which is why one should vote against the Democrats. Why one should vote against the Democrats. Last night I talked about why one should vote against the Republicans. Tonight I'll talk about why one should vote against the Democrats. And now let me just say this, and I did say this in the talk for anyone who actually listened. I'm a conservative person. I'm a Christian man. I teach the classical liberal arts. I have 10 children. I'm married to my high school sweetheart. I don't drink. I eat temperately. I live a very peaceful, quiet life in rural North Carolina. I'm a conservative person, morally, politically, economically, and so on. So any sort of personal attack against me because I talk freely, think freely, inquire freely on controversial subjects is just small-mindedness and ignorance, and it's never going to affect me because I frankly don't care what anyone thinks. As I said, one of the benefits of American life is the privacy that we enjoy. And I live a very private life, a peaceful, quiet life with my wife and children. And I really don't care what outsiders say. I especially don't care about any personal attacks or just childish nonsense like we're in middle school. It's just silly. It doesn't affect anything. And you just see that there are people who are, it's like they're still trying to become cool middle schoolers. And some of us were cool middle schoolers, and we're past that, and we're happy to be peaceful adults. So that kind of name-calling is really just ridiculous. Now, what I would say about the talk last night on why one should vote against the Republicans is that I pretty much said everything I can think of. I really don't have much more that I could say to support Democrats or to argue against Republicans. I made it pretty clear. I think that respecting the secular nature of our country is an important point to consider, and I do believe that Republicans commonly, especially Christians, go too far. I think the phrase that I used last night was, I think that they're politically covetous. I think they try to go too far, and when they go too far, they create precedents that allow Democrats to then respond and make use of the same mechanisms and instruments that the Republicans have established when they get the majority. And that's stupid on behalf of Republicans. That political covetousness, like we as Christian people, and I'll talk specifically about Christians, we don't need the state to make us happy. We don't need the state to provide for us. We don't need the state to give us our food and clothing. We don't need the state to give us affordable housing. We don't need the state to give us free food. We don't need EBT cards and all of this government welfare stuff. We don't need the state. We don't need the state to rub our bellies to live the Christian life. We can live under adverse circumstances. We can live through trials as Christians because we have the graces of faith, hope, and charity. So I really am not worried about what the state does. I simply don't want the state to overreach. And the problem with the state overreaching is that it's done by both sides politically. The conservatives, when they gain the majority, they overreach. And then when Democrats gain the majority, they feel that they're justified to fight fire with fire, and they overreach. And this back and forth, returning evil for evil by Christians, is not Christian. And so that's the fundamental problem that I have with Republicans, is that Christians are politically covetous. They're trying to take hold of American public property and make it subservient to the Christian cause. And Christianity doesn't need to live on welfare. Christianity doesn't need an EBT card. Christianity isn't worried about its health care. It's not worried about its retirement plan. It's not worried about any material prosperity or comfort. Christianity can sing in the fire. And yet the appearance is that Christianity is in fact trying to control public resources and use them to establish their own religion politically, and that is contrary to the Constitution. So that is a very serious objection that I have to the Republican cause, but really once we get past that and we get past the founding principles of the American founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so on, once we get past that, and I make the case that we have to be careful to respect those documents because we're talking about politics. This isn't a church council. We're not establishing Catholic doctrine. We're not deciding what the church should do. We're not deciding what individuals should do. We're not composing a catechism and voting on what should be put in and left out of it. This is a political discussion, and it's to serve the common good. And as Christians, we're to respect the fact that others don't have the graces that we have. Others don't have faith. Others don't have charity or hope. And we have to respect that. We have to look at our neighbors as people who are weak, who are poor, who don't have these things. And we make no sense when we grab them by the throat and scream at them to pay us what they owe when they're not capable of doing so. They don't have the strength to live according to Christian morals. And that's what the gospel, that's what the sacraments are for. So the political position of many Christian people is really irrational and contrary to the gospel. So when Democrats oppose Republicans from those angles, I agree with the Democrats. I think many Republicans are wrong in being politically covetous. But once I get past those basic principles, my ability to support Democrats runs empty. Obviously, there are lots of problems, and that's what I'd like to talk about tonight as I discuss why one should vote against the Democrats. Now, the danger in political talk is that we criticize our opponents, desiring to destroy their character. And the problem with doing that is that we're all evil. We're all sinful. When we dig up dirt on an opponent, people can dig up dirt on us. People could dig up dirt on me if they wanted to. I mean, there's not much because I live a pretty boring life. But if somebody wanted to find some scandalous event or some bad moment in my life, they could probably find someone who would be willing to tell a bad story or something like that. That's true for everyone. And so when we do that to our opponents, what are we really doing? I don't understand the mudslinging in politics. And so, just to begin, when we talk about Democrats, we really shouldn't be resorting to personal attacks, because much of what we say against others can be said back against us in some way. For example, right now in today's news, it's been discovered that there have been times when the VP nominee, or candidate, I guess I can call him now, because I think Walz is official as Harris's running mate. It's found that now he was in the National Guard, and apparently he was called up for deployment and resigned or left the National Guard and moved into civilian life at that time. And he's being accused of trying to dodge his deployment and abandoning his fellow soldiers when it was time to actually go and fight. And so Republicans are all over social media. J.D. Vance was criticizing, yelling about stolen valor today and all this. Now, where is this personal attack on Tim Walz going to lead when you have a Republican presidential candidate who also dodged military service? So this personal attack, it may make you feel good to try to tear someone apart, but the problem is your own candidate is going to be subject to the same criticism, and it's not going to produce any good effect. Even J.D. Vance, while he served in the Marines, when we get into the details, we find he wasn't some sort of like combat warrior out in the mud in the jungle with machine guns taking fire. He was a PR worker in the Marines, and that's great. That's wonderful. There are many different career options, many different roles to play in the military. That's all awesome. But to criticize the service of someone else, unless you're the guy who killed Osama bin Laden, someone's going to be able to criticize your military activity as well. It's just not a good argument. And if that's really what we're left with, if that's all we've got, then we're out of ammunition, and our cause is pretty empty. So Christians are going to have to actually develop substantial arguments and get out of this childish, stupid, hypocritical, back and forth personal attack that's become the normal mode in all American politics. And I would even argue, because I saw it in my own wife, Trump lost the 2020 election because of his petty nastiness, because of his personal attacks. He lost the 2020 election because of the personal attacks. And as I said, I saw it in my wife. My wife was a Trump supporter in 2016 and again in 2020. But the focus of the 2020 campaign for Donald Trump was attacking Hunter Biden. And all of these terrible photos of Hunter Biden were all over social media, and all of this nastiness about his drug use, sexual immorality, and so on were all targeted at Joe Biden. And my wife, listening to that, just really thought it was disgusting. Because if one of our children does go down a bad road, make bad decisions, and so on, that's not our fault. That's not the parent's fault. And the responsibility of the parent is to continue loving that child, to continue reaching out to that child, just as God continually reaches out to us. And so, if anything, we should be encouraging parents to be patient with their children, to stick it out, to continue to love them, to go with them through their troubles, and to pray and work that they may in the end come around, come back to their senses, and repent and live a good life. That's the only right response to a troubled child. And to watch Trump go after Joe Biden because of the drug addiction and immorality of Hunter Biden was really disgusting. And my wife lost all interest in Donald Trump because of that. And I know that many others did as well. It was terrible. So that kind of personal attacking, it's just terrible. It's shallow, it's empty, it's hypocritical. It's contrary to the Christian cause, and it ultimately causes us to lose because we have many good arguments to present. Now, let's just get to some of those arguments. When we look at the state of our country right now, there are some things that are just impossible to comprehend. One thing that I cannot comprehend, I think that I can't say all Americans, because we have to realize that a large percentage of Americans are crazy people. They really will vote for immoral things. They'll vote against police officers, to defund the police, and so on. I mean, crazy ideas. But we have to admit that crime in America is nuts. Crime is nuts. My daughter, one of my daughters, she's 19 years old. She has a part-time job working in a pharmacy, and so she's in the pharmacy, and as she's there, she actually works in a number of different. She works in a Walgreens in the pharmacies, and she actually works at a number of the local stores. And when she's there, she comes home from work and she just says, "Dad, you can't believe how much people are stealing from these stores." She's like, I'm there for 15 minutes and I see people running out of the stores with stuff, and then you've got all of these crazy policies. Well, if they don't steal more than $1,000, it's not this or that, and if you see someone stealing, don't confront them, don't say anything, don't try to stop them. And you look at these situations and say, what in the world is going on? What is the purpose of government if it's not to prevent crime? Crime prevention, law enforcement is one of the fundamental responsibilities of the government, and we're not doing it. We're actually protecting criminals when they commit crime. And I don't know, I look at something like that and I feel like I'm going to go crazy. And then we listen to the politicians, and the politicians on the liberal side, on the Democrat side, almost take the side of the criminals. And in some local races, I've actually heard candidates take the side of the criminals and say that they're forced by whatever, systemic racism or lack of opportunity, all of these things they come up with. They say that these people are actually being forced to do these things to survive. And now we all look at that and say to ourselves, dude, they're stealing like designer clothes, Nike shoes, and televisions. They're not stealing bread. They're not stealing gallons of milk for their children and containers of peanut butter or other, basic foods that poor people would be looking for. They're stealing luxury goods. Now, maybe they're reselling them, whatever. But the theft culture, the looting that we saw during the Black Lives Matter riots, stuff like that, there's just no way that can be allowed in society. We need a government who's going to destroy that and make it impossible. Now, if we think about our military policy in America, think of what Ronald Reagan taught back in the 80s. We taught this concept of peace through strength. And what that means, it's pretty simple. We're going to make ourselves so strong. And when we are provoked, we're going to respond so strongly, with so much power. If you think back to the Persian Gulf War and the idea of shock and awe, we're going to respond so forcefully and have so much power that no one is going to bother us. And we're going to have peace because of our great strength. Now, internationally, militarily, that's been very effective. And when we go through the 80s and 90s, we see, especially at that time, we see America with great respect internationally. Because everyone knows, and I mean, you can take a terrible event like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and say, whoa, we don't want to mess with the Americans. And that notion of peace through strength becomes a deterrent for war. We know that. We know that politically. We know that internationally, militarily. The same principle applies to law enforcement. If law enforcement is going to be effective, criminals have to know that you can't mess with the police. You can't mess with store owners, and so on. And we're not saying this because we want to see people killed or injured or whatever, but we want the message to be, don't do it. Because we're going to respond with strength, and we don't want to, but we can and we will. And that's the notion of peace through strength. And when we see law enforcement doing the opposite and just letting all hell break loose because we're afraid of offending criminals, or we're afraid of injuring a criminal, you just see that government is upside down. We're paying taxes and doing our part as civilians to fund a government that is not serving the common good. And, that sort of thing, when we look at the two parties, I feel confident that the Republican Party will support police officers and promote peace through strength, not abroad, but on our streets. So that's one reason why I would argue against the Democrats, is that they don't take law enforcement seriously. They don't take American domestic safety and tranquility seriously. I don't understand it, but they don't. So that's one thing. Now, related to that is another fiasco that we currently see, and it's the border crisis. And this, I am not a subscriber to conspiracy theories. People are attracted to conspiracy theories because they want to pretend that they know the causes when they have no evidence to support their ideas about those causes. They're not necessarily wrong, but they can't prove that they're right either. And that's just what a conspiracy theory is. It's a theory. It's a theory, and it's called a conspiracy because there's no evidence. They simply string together these different symptoms and suggest that there might be some common cause. But I don't accept any talk of conspiracy theories beyond it being a theory, which is fine. But what's strange is that what we see going on with the American border, this idea of open borders, which again is just, it's the opposite of what government is for. It's not a government policy. It's not an option for the government to decide to open the borders. It's one of the fundamental duties of the government is to protect the people. And again, there's local application of this through law enforcement, but there's also a broader application of this with the protecting of our borders. We've got whole agencies established by the federal government for this purpose alone, to protect our borders. And therefore, it's not the government's decision to open the borders or to knowingly allow people to enter our country illegally. And we can see how this relates between local law enforcement and border protection on the federal level. And what's strange is we see the same issue going on in other Western countries. In England right now, the streets are all upside down with riots and all kinds of craziness because of this so-called refugee program that's letting foreigners into the country with no plan for what they're going to do. And we know that the people coming in are not people who share our values, understand the principles of our constitutions and government. What are they going to do? It's very strange what's going on, and I don't know what causes it. I'm willing to chalk it up to spiritual causes and just sort of leave it at that. But we see no law enforcement at the local level, and we see no border security at the federal level. And when we look at the two parties and ask, who's going to take up the defense of the border, again, we find that that's more of a Republican position, and the Democrats think it's a joke. They think this open border idea is like some kind of charitable work, a generous Good Samaritan spirit, and it's just really crazy. So the protection of the people being a fundamental duty of government, and the neglect of that duty, the despising of that duty, is one reason why I believe it's necessary to vote against the Democrats. The government must provide safety to the people. That's fundamental. And the Democrat Party, at the federal level and at the local level, doesn't seem interested in doing that, and therefore I don't think that they should be allowed to have power. So notice that what I'm trying to do is not address personal character issues of candidates, but get to the policies, because the policies, I think, are very obvious. And I don't think that there's very much disagreement. As I said, I know that there are many Americans who are crazy with these things, who want to defund the police, who want to have our borders open. And of course they take no responsibility for the consequences. But the majority of Americans want to be safe. And that should just be a fundamental, where the Republican Party should be campaigning as the party that promises to make America safe again. And I'm not sure if Trump has said that, but that needs to be a campaign priority. We want to be safe. That's fundamental. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing would be getting into economics. Again, when I look at liberal talk in politics, sometimes I just feel like I'm going to go crazy. I really don't understand how they think. And that's why, I come to a point in my thinking politically where I just don't believe that we're supposed to live together. I just believe that some kind of either segregation of the population, where people who think one way are allowed to live over here and people who think another way are allowed to live over here, should be promoted, because I don't think that these two sides can ever be reconciled. They're so fundamentally opposed to one another. And frankly, I don't want to pretend like we're going to have peace between us. We're not. It's impossible to live together when the most fundamental principles are disagreed on. And so when we come to economic issues, the fundamental Republican policy is that the people are left with a free market, and the market, that is the people, by their decisions in the market, they direct the progress of the market. And some will complain and say, oh, well, if the market does this, yes, short term there may be problems, but in the long term, the economy can be run by a free market, with the people voting in the market with their money, in the same way that they vote in political circles at election time. And so, I particularly support the idea of a free market. Now, one of the problems, of course, is because of the political covetousness I talked about before, Republicans themselves have abandoned the principles of free market economy. Republicans themselves have tried to drag the government into the market, to control things, to manage things, to keep things supported artificially, and so on. And Republicans themselves have violated the principles of free market capitalism. And of course, when the Democrats come into power, they point that out and ignore all the arguments that the Republicans make about them being socialists or communists or not respecting the market or being opposed to capitalism and so on. They say, you do the same things. Give us a break. And that's it. And that's, again, owed to that political covetousness I talked about before. But the economy that was supposed to exist in America was an economy that was established by the people and for the people. It was supposed to be a free market where there's competition, and the people, as consumers, ultimately decide what to invest in and what to ignore. That which is not invested in can't exist. That which is invested in becomes prosperous. And that just goes on, with the market continually deciding what they would like to support and what they would like to not support. The challenge in that situation, of course, is to develop great skill and to work with great industry, because we've got to compete to win the investment of the consumer, whether that consumer be a private individual or a business. We talk about business-to-business sales and things like that. But you've got to create the best mousetrap. You've got to create a better mousetrap than the mousetrap that everyone is currently using. And that promotes innovation. When we go back further into American history, we find just such amazing innovation, such drive for invention and manufacturing and so on. because the market would reward someone who comes up with a solution, a better solution. And that's how the American economy was supposed to work. And so we're challenged to study, we're challenged to work hard, we're challenged to think critically, to think outside the box, to solve problems, and so on. And that's just such a virtuous culture to develop, and that was the culture of early America. When we look back to the Founding Fathers, for example, we find so many just curious stories of their own innovative kind of activity, like Benjamin Franklin, discovering or gaining knowledge of electricity, Thomas Jefferson supposedly inventing the swivel chair. There's all these stories about the Founding Fathers just in their own private lives being tinkerers and innovators, coming up with solutions to problems and things like that. And you just see that curious, innovative, entrepreneurial spirit in the American Founding Fathers. I mean, among people who started a nation from scratch. It's just such an inspiring, cool time to study and learn about. They sail across the ocean and come into a land where they've got to build the whole thing from scratch. And to see men do that, to see the resourcefulness of the men and how they figure out how to do it, it's just inspiring. And then when we look at our own lives and our own generations, we say, well, how can I be the same way? How can I improve my community or serve my neighbor by using my intelligence and my industry to develop solutions to problems we face? That's just such good, healthy, working culture. And we can talk about that, but then we turn around and listen to the Democrats talk about all of their social welfare programs, and we find people, able-bodied men with no intention of ever working because they get government-funded debit cards that they can use at the grocery store, that they can use at Walmart. And you look at these men, 27-year-old, able-bodied man who is never going to work because he has no need to work, because the government just gives him resources. And we look to the Bible as Christians, and we see a simple principle that he who does not work shall not eat. And that's not a principle based on divine revelation. That's just a simple, functional principle that if you don't work, you can't eat. But when the government gets involved artificially, they say, oh, that's not true because we can use tax money taken from the working class to give free food to men who are poor because they don't work. We're not talking about feeding the crippled. We're not talking about feeding orphans. We're talking about feeding young, working-age men. And then we get into why they don't work, and you find, oh my goodness, there's a bazillion problems, but like those problems need to be solved, not just covered with a Band-Aid of welfare services. And when you listen to the Democrats with all of their promises, all of their plans, all of their guaranteed everything for everyone, you just feel like you're going to go crazy. Like how is this possibly going to be funded and maintained? We think about the ancient Romans and the corruption of the empire and the idea of bread and circuses. If you're not familiar with the Roman notion of bread and circuses, it's that if you entertain the people, keep them all fed, and keep them entertained, they'll just sort of stay out of political affairs and just leave the politics to the to the noble class, and the nobles get to enjoy all of the power and control and influence, because the common people they're just concerned with pleasures, simple bodily pleasure. So just give them food and give them entertainment, and they'll stay out of the important stuff. It's like handing your kid an iPad and telling them to go, sit in the living room and get lost for a couple hours because I want to do something else. That's the idea of bread and circuses. And then you come to America and it's like, my goodness, we're not talking about bread and circuses. We're talking about universal basic income where you get thousands of dollars a month for nothing. We're talking about free internet service, so you can have 24/7 access to every single video, song, television show that was ever made in history, whenever you want it, as much as you want it. It's like bread and circuses to the 50th power, just out of control indulgence of the common people that just makes them all numb, as it were. Makes them dependent on Democrat politicians, makes them dependent on Democrat policies, and so on. And compare that to the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurialism and free market capitalism that I talked about before, and you've got two completely different civilizations standing next to each other. And, for me, as a business owner, as a man who started a business and maintains a private business, I work constantly. My business is my whole life. I'm responsible for every aspect of it. Things can go wrong at any time, and I'm always on call. It's my business. It's the means of my livelihood. It's my life's vocation. That life produces in me so many virtues that I really don't know what my Christian life would look like without the pressure of my private business. And when I think about men, or also when I think about how much I've learned, how much practical prudence I've gained in my life through the years because of this constant pressure to work and solve problems and come up with solutions and innovate and just go on and on, constantly accepting changing circumstances and responding to them and trying to look ahead and anticipate changes and prepare for them. That's just such a good, healthy environment to live in as a layperson. And when I think about, again, how much I've learned through the years, and if I were to start a new project today, just how efficient I could go about it because of all of the experience that I've gained, connections I've developed, resources I've gathered, and so on. And then to think of men who never do any of that work, understand none of those issues. Those men are just hamstrung for life. It's one thing to not work when you're young because it's difficult to get started as a young adult. But to not work because you're not even challenged to work, you're not even required to work, and to just stay in that initial unemployed state, it's just cultural death. I can't even imagine living like that for 5 minutes. But the Democrat platform treats American people as if that way of life is some sort of right that people have. And they simply offer endless promises of more and more benefits, whether they're benefits to artificially enrich school teachers by raising all their salaries and making their lives easier, or by welfare programs that give out free food, free clothes, free housing, free phones, free all of these different things. It just does not promote virtue among American citizens. And you can say, oh, well, it's charitable, it's this or that. That's just such a condescending view of our neighbor, to look at him and say, oh, that poor, black man, he can't figure out how to work. It's so condescending. If I think to myself, if anything is racist, it's treating a race of people as if they can't figure out how to do things, and always acting like we need to do this for you. Oh, let me do that for you. Let me get that for you because, I'm white and you're black. Let me do that for you. Let me help you out here. That's a condescending and racist attitude. But when we listen to these political debates, we often hear the Democrats accusing the Republicans of racism and prejudice and all this kind of stuff, but every single word out of their mouths is condescending towards other races, towards different groups of people, and so on. If you believe in your neighbor, then you believe that he can make it on his own. You believe that he can find a way. You believe that while he may need some help, just as is common to all people, which normally comes from fathers, which again raises another question. If you believe in your neighbor, then you trust that he can do it. He can make his way, especially in America, where it's relatively easy to earn a living. But to constantly give handouts to different people and to emphasize that it's for people of a certain race or a certain ethnic background or a certain whatever the qualification may be, that's just intrinsically condescending and discriminatory. But it's presented as being generous and charitable. And so to bring this second point to a close here, economically, there's just no sustainable plan for Democrat economic policies. There's no plan. There's no plan. Whereas a Republican economic policy challenges the American people to be self-reliant, as the Founding Fathers said they should be. That concept of self-reliance was an American principle. Self-reliance, to not allow anyone to do for you something that you can do for yourself. And again, this ties to the Christian principle of whoever does not work should not eat. I just don't understand how a democratic economic plan can be sustained. Now we see this on a micro scale. We see this in many institutions. We see this on a micro scale. We'll see, for example, a school started. Let's take Harvard. A school will be started from scratch by Christian men. They will conceive the idea. They will make the initial investments. They will do the design work. And they will do the humble work of founding and starting the institution. And they will make it successful. And it will grow, and it will become more successful, and it will grow, and it will become more successful. And at the core of its success will be these fundamental principles that make the institution successful. For example, with Harvard, the motto is simply veritas, right? Truth. And we just see that it's this simple American spirit, this old world Christian work ethic and desire for truth that's at the core of this university that's established, and it grows and becomes more and more prestigious over time until it gains almost this magical character. And then this liberal thinking comes in, which contradicts all of those founding principles that were responsible for the institution's success, which has led the institution to store up a massive endowment. Harvard's endowment right now is over $50 billion. It's the richest school in the world. But that endowment was built largely by old school academics. And yet, as time goes on, this Democrat liberal concept of economics begins to enter into the institution and gain control of influential positions and begin to change policies and do things. And all of the growth stops. All of the increase, all of the profit stops. And the stored up capital, the inherited capital, just begins to be burned. And these liberal ideas are parasitic. They simply consume resources that are gathered together by others, almost like they steal them from people. And this is how liberal culture seems to work. It seems to rise up when people become prosperous and then simply consume that prosperity and return people back to their original state when they've got to get to work again, and they abandon the liberal principles because the liberal principles don't allow for growth. And so they have to go back to conservative principles in order to build. And then once they build and once they begin to be prosperous, then all of a sudden the next generation is spoiled by it, begins to live off the capital and just consume until it's broken down again. And it just seems that that's all liberal economics do, is consume everything that's available. And maybe it's just a providential thing, but when you look at it from a position of responsibility, you just have to acknowledge that there's just no way for it to be sustained. So economically, I think the democratic policies they're just impossible. And so that's a second and important point that I would argue requires men to vote against Democrats. Now, a third point that we gets into moral issues. And these are some of the most commonly argued about issues in these discussions, and we're approaching an hour, so I'm going to be quick here because I think most people are familiar with these issues. But we've got issues like the whole LGBTQ community and that whole movement, with transgenderism and all of that. We've got abortion and contraception and these things. And again, we have to be careful because in political discussions, we should restrict ourselves to arguments that are drawn from principles that our opponents acknowledge. So when we look at things like the LGBTQ movement and abortion and contraception, we've got to develop natural arguments. And one of the problems with arguing issues of morality is that many of us who are morally upright people, we're modest. We're modest. We don't talk about these topics publicly. We're modest. Even in marriage, many of us are modest. My wife and I are modest. And so I would prefer not to even talk with my wife about sexual matters or the kinds of things that are not just discussed but displayed and promoted on the streets, as it were, publicly by these groups of people. And the problem is it's easy to say, well, I know an easy way to address this. Let's just argue it from a religious perspective and say that God says this or that. Let's say that this is not God's will, this is abominable to God, and so on. And while I know that many think that that's the way, it just gets laughed out of the room. And so then we look at, can we make any natural arguments? Can we argue from health? And that's dangerous because that's backfired on Christians before. One of the reasons why Roe versus Wade was originally successful was because an argument against abortion was dependent on the danger of abortion. And when hospital practices increased and the safety of abortions, the safety of abortion procedures increased, the health argument ended up allowing people to move towards the abortion side. So we have to be careful of taking the argument from health and safety. But when we have to deal with these immoral issues, sometimes we can know what the obvious answers are, what the obvious problems are, the obvious arguments, but we simply don't want to talk about these things, especially in a public environment. I really don't want to have to explain what's wrong with homosexuality from a natural perspective in public. I really don't want to have to do that. I really don't want to have to talk about what's wrong with an abortion in a public environment. And I know, you've got this pro-life movement that'll go out and put up billboards and posters of aborted fetuses. It's just disgusting. It's disgusting. And that makes it very hard to deal with publicly because it's just a crude, as my mother used to say, vulgar subject to have to even talk about, let alone think about. And to have to enter into that world where these people live with these really filthy lifestyles. It's very difficult for Christians to do that because we just don't want to. I don't want these things in my mind. I don't want to think or talk about these things. I don't want to stand in public and have these discussions. I don't want to see the images and so on. This has absolutely nothing to do with my life. And so the challenge in some of these issues, especially when immorality really explodes, is that it becomes very difficult to maintain a modest culture and to deal with these immodest things. And that's why I don't think that the proper place for those discussions is the public sphere. I think that these issues are issues that should be addressed by means of evangelization, and it should be private, and they should be discussed privately. And I think if we address the real issues, the real fundamental issues which really relate to the gospel, I don't think we'll need to get into these vulgar and disgusting discussions. But again, when we look at the two parties, we can look at the Republican Party and see that at least for the most part in the past, they have been strongly against abortion. And then when we turn to the other side, to the Democrat side, we find almost, a crazy celebration of abortion. Literally, women like jumping up and down, jumping around, excited that abortion is not just legal, but legal so that a child can be aborted at the very end of pregnancy. And we can see that there's something wrong there. There's something spiritually wrong, and the remedy for that is not in political public arguments, but in evangelization. So I'm going to stop there because it's an hour. We've talked about just some basic issues of government, namely public safety, that should be a reason to vote against Democrats. We looked at economic issues that should be reasons to vote against Democrats, and then moral issues. But again, I would emphasize that just because we may be on the right side of an argument, it doesn't mean that the means that people use are good. They're not necessarily prudent. And as I just explained, the solution to many of these problems is found in the gospel. And if we really want to improve our society, if we really want to so-called make America great again, or let's just say make America great. I don't like the whole again thing. Just make America great. We have to evangelize. We have to lead people out of sin into God's grace. If we don't do that, these evils are not going to go away. People are not going to turn around because we show them an offensive picture of an aborted fetus. They already know that. They know that. Because we talk about the disgusting nature of homosexual activity. They already know that. They're not ignorant. People are not ignorant of these things. The problem is deeper. The problem is deeper. And ultimately, it's spiritual, and the remedy for it is salvation, is actually union with God, is regeneration. And so we've got to acknowledge these things, think of good arguments, think of good defenses, but at the same time realize that we're really ignoring the giant elephant in the room, which is that these people are spiritually dead. That's the real problem. Let's stop pretending that we just have to come up with some clever arguments, that Christ really didn't need to come into the world and suffer and offer himself as an atonement for sin and send the Holy Spirit, establish the church and the sacraments. We can't pretend that all of those things are unnecessary and we just need some clever political arguments. The problems are deeper, and even if we're right, it doesn't matter, because the reason we think the way we do is largely because of the influence of God's grace in our lives. And if we look at our neighbors with all of their issues, all of their problems, all of their confusing ideas, all of their mind-boggling views of things, if we don't look at them as lost sheep who are in need of salvation, we become really callous and arrogant and reckless, and that's what leads to the political errors that actually cause us to lose. We make tragic errors in political action that actually causes the momentum to turn against us and swing radically in the opposite direction, and it's our fault, because really we've got to look at our neighbors with compassion and mercy, and we have to look at them through the eyes of the gospel. And until we do that, these political decisions are going to continue to just be contentious, but the only people who can solve this problem are the Christians. But the problem is we've got to actually be Christians. We've got to actually live and think and act like Christians. And the principal mission of Christians is to go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them in that context of grace in the church, teaching them to observe all that Christ has commanded. We can't flip that around, because when we do so, we make the passion of Christ to have been unnecessary. All we needed was some good political arguments, and that's obviously false. And there are consequences when we act like that, and that's one of the reasons why things are so bad. So anyway, I want to cut this off now. I hope that's helpful. Addressing the policies, learning about the policies, arguing policy issues, not arguing personal attacks. It's really the only way to engage in politics as a Christian, and most importantly, to evangelize. And remember that like Jesus says, what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So human prosperity, national prosperity, political prosperity, it's all vanity if we don't actually save our own souls. So I hope that's helpful. God bless.